We're ready to get ourselves started today. So go ahead and turn in your Bible to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews. That's where our little survey is going to lead us to today, is the book of Hebrews. Now, one of the there's lots of interesting things about Hebrews, about the way it's put together and about all these other things. And we hopefully will be able to spend some time on introductory matters. You may remember we covered Hebrews in here fairly deeply for about 6 months, about 2 years ago. Now, of course, we can never remember the sermon from 3 weeks ago. So 2 years ago, Bible class may be a while. But maybe as we go through it, you'll remember some of this stuff. And maybe not. And if you don't remember the stuff, that is perfectly fine because we will catch up again. Opening up Hebrews, one of the things about it is Hebrews, it's hard to figure out who in the world wrote this book. If you have a King James Version, it may say written by St. Paul or the Apostle Paul. It may say Hebrews written by St. Paul or the Apostle Paul underneath it. You remember that part? The titles are not inspired. We're not exactly sure who wrote this book. The problem with saying that Paul wrote the book is it's written in a different accent as far as the Greek language than what Paul wrote his books in. And so it's got a different tone of voice. And there are some modes where similar phraseology will come, but there's a lot of different phraseology. It's like, say somebody's a Cajun, and you finally figure out how they talk, and one day they call you on the phone and they have a Boston accent. You think very quickly, this is not the same person. They say, well, yeah, I am. Well, I don't think you are, because the accent is so different. That's how Hebrews works. And so Hebrews, when you go into 1st century, 2nd century, you see a lot of arguing back and forth about exactly who would have written this book and who it came from. You see some from 275 or so who said Paul wrote it. Other people would say, well, this must come from Barnabas. Martin Luther, who was around in the 1600s, really would like to say that Apollos wrote it because it's such an eloquent book. Apollos is known to be an eloquent Christian or eloquent preacher. And so Martin Luther really liked the idea of saying that Apollos wrote it. Really, we just don't know. There's just not a proof one way or the other of who exactly could have written it. Now, you go back sometimes, and some people are afraid to admit that because they're afraid to say, well, if we don't know who wrote it, how can we know it's inspired? Because anything written by an apostle would be inspired as far as we'd know. And so it's something that makes people nervous sometimes, but I don't think it needs to be something that we're nervous from because we don't have to know. We just know that if it's in the Bible. Did you have someone, Sonny? I know I walked past you like 3 or 4 times today. It doesn't have to, we don't know exactly. All right. Now I keep walking around and run out of paper. I better stop walking around. But getting back into the book, you see it opens differently than any other book. It opens like it's a sermon, or it opens like an essay. Continues on like a sermon. In fact, if you'll notice, about 4 chapters to the end, he says, here's my concluding point. You know how preachers are. They're never telling the truth on that part, are they? I'm closing. Here they are 20 minutes later talking. You're like, yeah, sure you are. It goes like that, and then it ends like a letter. So it kind of goes and hits the gamuts of all those sort of things that come across. It's written in such a beautiful way, isn't it? You open up chapter 1. God, who at sundry times in diverse manners spoken times past to the fathers through the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. And as you go through that, it's so majestic in the way that it's put. Now, let's talk about the recipients. Who is it that received this book? Jewish Christians. And you can imagine how different their world is. Now, in churches, you usually have 2 different groups of churches, or 2 different groups in a church. You have people who grew up in the Lord's church. They grew up, they've always worshiped this way, they've always heard these same sermons, they've always, this is very usual to them. Then you have those who are converted out of denominations or converted out of different churches. And they come, and it's just a whole different world as they're seeing there. The music is really different. There's not the concert atmosphere necessarily. The sermons are a lot less showy, a lot more Bible-filled. It's just worship is very different. Now, a lot of times people like it better that way, but it's a different experience. And sometimes it's hard when you're used to worshiping that old way to suddenly pop back to this new way, this just thus saith the Lord kind of stuff that we do. Well, imagine what it was like as a Jewish Christian. You're raised up always hearing you're the people of God. This is how God's people act. You are not allowed to do anything on the Sabbath because that day belongs to the Lord and that day is the seventh day. You're not allowed to eat certain meats. You're not allowed to do certain practices. You're not allowed to be anywhere near the pagan temples. And you go through all these different rules that they had. And imagine if one day Paul or another gospel preacher came through town and said, listen, everything you've ever heard and everything you've ever believed as far as the old covenant is done with. Now there's a new way and a better way to be a Christian. Well, you hear it, you see the freedom that's there in the gospel, and you're excited about that new freedom that's there. And so you start living that way, and it's awesome. But then most of your family doesn't convert. And now your family excommunicates you or throws you out. There's no longer the different times of fellowship that you would be with them. And so you feel the pain in losing people because of your faith. And then the community where you worked, they're all Jewish. Everybody that's around you centers around the synagogue. Well, now that you have left their faith and become a part of the faith, now perhaps your job's a little bit harder to find. Now perhaps that network that you had, that you relied on for your business, perhaps that network's dried up. And as you go through all these things, there's going to be a temptation oftentimes to go back to the way in which you were. Look through our church history sometime and look at a lot of the people who are baptized. A lot of people from the Lord's church or who grew up in the church, they're baptized, they go along. That's not necessarily who I'm talking about. Look for people who were not religious at all, who became Christians. When they obeyed the gospel, watch them and see what happens to them after about a year or after about 2 years. Because it's easy to obey the gospel, but it's harder to be faithful to the gospel. And that's to whom this book is written. People who obeyed, but once they obeyed, now that they're going and some of the excitement is worn off, it's a lot easier to kind of fade back and say, I miss my old way of life. I miss my friends. I miss my family. I miss what I'm used to experiencing. And so maybe there's not a conscious leaving of the faith, but there's a gradual not being as faithful sort of thing going on here. And that's a little bit of what I think we see happening through this book as it goes through. And so as we go through it, I've dated it around the age of 65 AD. Most of your commentaries that you run through are going to say 63 to 67, somewhere in that area. Just about all of them are going to be before 70 AD. Because what happened in AD 70? 68 to 70, what happened? They were scattered, okay. All right. The emperors came through, Titus and others came through and destroyed Jerusalem, tore down the temple, and the sacrifice system was done away with. So if Hebrews would have been written after 70 AD, it would have sounded a lot different because Judaism as a religion no longer existed. So this had to be written before that happened. So most people think somewhere in the mid-60s is going to be where the date of this book belongs. All right, let's do a very quick survey because I want to spend some time on our verses and spend some time especially on our vegetable chapter, the lettuce chapter, there in chapter 10. But as we do about a survey, I've tried to look at each one and say this is better because I think that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get across. Think of the book of Hebrews as a hill, okay? My oldest son likes to run cross country, and from what he says, you recognize hills when you're running a lot more than you recognize them when you're driving, So, I was talking to another fella yesterday talking about a cross country course, and he was reciting every hill that had been in all the different races. He's like, at Marshall County, there's this and this and this, and over here at Graves County, there's, he knows his hills. Well, think of a topographical map of the book of Hebrews. You're going to start here in chapter 1. He's going to say we've got a better preacher. It is better. And what we're going to do is we're going to move ourselves up, and then boom, we hit Hebrews 9. We have passed the tree line. You know, if you go to Colorado, where you pass the tree line on these mountains, and 9 and 10 are where the book of Hebrews, that is where he wants to get. Sometimes when I make a sermon, I know what I want to say, but I got to figure out how to make the introduction. I got to figure out how to make the conclusion, but I know what I want to say. That's what the writer of Hebrews is doing. 9 and 10 is what he wants. 1 through 8 is to get us there. And then 11 says, hey, look, that's why we were there. Look at these guys. That's why 10 is so important. 12 and 13 are kind of closing everything up and kind of looking back as well. And so if you're making a topographical map of the book of Hebrews, 9 and 10 is your mountain. Everything else is a ramp to get up there. And then everything else kind of goes down sloping a little bit because he wants to keep you up there as long as possible. And so notice that. Chapter 1, we have got a better messenger. All right? Look there in verses 1 and 2. We just looked at that, right? God who at different times in different ways. That's how my New King James says it. I love the King James in this passage. God who at sundry times in diverse manners. I love the way that goes. God who in all these different ways spoke to the prophets in times past. Think of Moses. Think of Elijah. Think of Jeremiah. Think of all these guys getting spoken to from the still small voice with Elijah, from the bush, as far as Moses, from Gideon throwing that fleece on the ground. You know, God spoke to these guys in all these different ways. Has spoken to us this day by whom? His Son, Jesus. If you hear a message from God today, it comes from Jesus. He is the messenger. That's where you go. You don't go to Muhammad. You don't go to Moses. You don't go to all these other people. You go to Jesus. Jesus is where that message comes. God, who at various times, various ways, spoke times past to the fathers through the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, through whom he created the world and through whom all things exist. Now, during this time in the Hebrew economy, they had become a little bit more on the superstitious side. They were very influenced by the later parts of the book of Daniel. And they had really gotten into angels. Angels are where it's at. And so they would look to see where angels would come and communicate to people. And we see that even in the New Testament, right? Gabriel, other ones would come to Mary and to Elizabeth to tell them you're going to have a child. Sometimes in the book of Acts, we see angels. Those sort of things would appear to Peter to release him from prison and different things such as that. Angels spoke of the resurrection of Christ right at the grave. And so the Hebrew mind was very wrapped around angels. You know, angels were who they were looking for to give them a special revelation. And so you'll see in the rest of the book of, rest of that chapter of Hebrews 1, you see that Jesus is better than to all of the angels. None of these angels compare to Jesus. He's the one who rules. He is the one who is over all things. You need to listen to Jesus. Going right back to Matthew 17, right? Peter says, man, here's these 3 tabernacles, Jesus. You're as good as Elijah. You're as good as Moses. And that voice comes down from heaven that says what? This is my beloved Son. Hear ye him. Listen to Jesus. All right? Now today, we bring chapter 1 to today. What are some ways, besides Jesus, people claim to hear revelation? Okay, people have visions and dreams. God, sometimes there's just a leading. You know, you feel in your heart that you need to do this. Or you feel in your heart, God has told me I need to go in this direction. Okay? So visions, dreams, what you got?
There's a lot of attributing to the Holy Ghost has spoken to him.
Okay. The Spirit has moved me. Okay. All right.
Spoken to him.
Yeah, spoken to him. Okay. That still small voice that comes within you. Okay. Very good. Going back 1 Kings 19, that still small voice. Okay. Sometimes he speaks to us through the pastor, through the preacher. That's where I get my revelation from. Whatever the pastor says, that's what I'm going to follow, right? Whatever the preacher says. There's a lot of people who come a lot of different ways and say, well, sometimes it's just by reason. I think it ought to be this way. God would not make a command this way, right? 1 Kings 5, Naaman. Okay? He comes to Elisha, and he has leprosy. And he comes up, and Elisha tells him to do what? Dip 7 times in the Jordan River. And what does he say? Well, I thought he was going to wave his hand and do something really special. He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't realize all the wealth I've got to just send a servant out and tell me just go dip myself 7 times in a dirty river. The Profar and the other rivers there in his homeland were a lot bigger and a lot prettier. That is just dumb, right? That's my translation, by the way. I don't know if he said dumb, actually. Okay? But that's the gist of it. So the Hebrew girl, slave girl, said what? If he would have told you to do something great, you would have done it. This is something small, so what? You need to go ahead and do it. So Naaman went and dipped himself 7 times, and he was clean. Okay? Well, a lot of times, one of the reasons we don't like just getting our scripture from the Bible and studying those things out for ourselves is it's just not flashy enough. It's just not profound feeling like other things. But your gospel has got to come from Scripture. He is the better messenger. Jesus is the one through whom we listen today. All right? So that's a great beginning. Now, chapter 2, oftentimes, if you are outlining the book, is connected to chapter 1. But I like to make it different because there's a greater responsibility. Because if God required this of those in the Old Testament, guess what God's going to require to us today? Did God require he be listened to in the Old Testament? What happened in the Old Testament if you didn't listen to him? Give me an example. Okay, you draw Nadab and Abihu, all right? They felt the fire of the Lord, right? Because they worshiped in the wrong way. Korah rebelled against Moses. He was a cousin, and he said, listen, I've decided God's going to speak through me because you obviously have not stopped to ask for directions. We have walked in this wilderness for 38 years. God's going to speak through me now. And so Moses said, the ones who believe in me, stay over here. The ones who listen to Korah, get over there. And the earth swallowed those people up. What you got, Van?
That was the 25,000 or so that the earth swallowed up.
Yeah. Okay. You look at many of the others who would have different ideas and different things, okay? So we are under a greater responsibility here. You get to chapter 3. Who was the Jews? Who was the guy that they really liked to listen to? Their favorite fella? It'd be Moses, right? Now look through chapter 3. How is Jesus better than Moses? Perfect. Okay, he's perfect. Was Moses perfect? No. Right. Okay. Look here in verse 3. Okay. Chapter 3, verse 3 of Hebrews. For this one has been counted worthy of much more glory than Moses, inasmuch he who has built the house has more honor than the house. Every house is built by someone, but he who builds all things is God. Okay. All right. You got a guy who built the house, who built the old covenant. Is going to be more important than the guy who gave the old covenant. Okay? Now Moses, verse 5, was faithful in all of his house as a servant, to testimony of these things afterward. But Christ is the son of his own house, whose house we hold fast, the confidence and rejoicing of the hope, therefore all the way to the end. All right. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is, listen, you are consumed about the guy who runs the door. You know, the little doorbell guy? You're consumed about this guy who's here. This is who you really care about. And so it's kind of an interesting sort of thing there, because who is it we really need to care about? The guy who owns a house, right? I was at a doctor's office, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, and it was a physical therapy unit, walking around doing visits and doing different things. And a lady said, follow me, one of the nurses, and she went to the elevator, pushed the button on the elevator. We went up to a certain floor, you know, that sort of thing, and then she dropped me off. And I went to do my visit, do my thing, came back, and she took me back down. On the way down, I said, how many times a day you go up and down this elevator? And she said, I never thought about it. Several dozen, though. And I said, well, you need one of those suits and a little bell and a hat. And I think I was way too old for her to understand what that was about, because she was just a 23-year-old, you know. You remember those old guys who used to do the elevators all day, you know, in the movies? But she didn't get it at all. But, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. What a job. Up the elevator, down the elevator, up the elevator. And I thought, how many dumb jokes does she hear during the day? She probably can recite every one that I can think of, an elevator joke. Well, in this analogy, Moses is the elevator guy. It's pretty cool seeing him, but he is not who the house is run by. They need to focus on Jesus and not focus on just the servant. Not just focus on a mortal man who, like Van said earlier, is just a guy. He's not perfect. He doesn't have everything right. So focus there on Jesus, because that is where that focus needs to be. All right, some beautiful passages here. Let's look at verse 12. This chapter 3. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, as long as it's called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Sometime if you're making up a lesson or a devotional, go through there and notice that word exhort. Because you're going to find it about 4 times through Scripture, and there's 4 different reasons and 4 different ways to exhort through the book of Hebrews. And that's a fun little lesson to bring up. All right, so if Moses is so great, and yes, Moses is great, starting there in verse 16, okay, Moses freed the people from Egypt, right? Brought them into the wilderness. He is their leader. Now, what happened to all the people that Moses brought through the wilderness? They died. Everybody except 2, Joshua and Caleb, right? They died. Now, Jesus has brought us out of sin. But what's going to happen to us as we go through the wilderness of life? Is he going to lose us? No. He's a greater leader. He's not going to lose us in the wilderness. And, of course, that's not all the fault of Moses necessarily. But you see there an illustration of the difference there as they would come through. Chapter 4, a greater promised land. And he uses 2 different, you're not supposed to mix your metaphors, but here the writer of Hebrews is inspired, and so he can do it, right? Okay? 2 different metaphors. First metaphor is Joshua. Joshua is a Hebrew name. Yeshua, it's the same name as Jesus. Joshua and Jesus have the same Hebrew name. Okay? Now, what's the significance of that? Joshua led his people where? Okay, through the Jordan to the promised land. Jesus is leading us from this world of sin into heaven, right? Okay, so you see Moses can't bring his people into the wilderness or bring his people to the promised land. He fell short, but Joshua did deliver that rest. He did deliver that people to the place where they needed to be. And the same way, now you and I have a Savior, a leader. He's not a Moses, he's a Joshua. And he will give us that rest that's there. Now, another illustration used in chapter 4 is talking about the Sabbath day. Look here in verse 4, chapter 4, verse 4. For he has spoken in a certain place in the 7th day in this way, God rested on the 7th day from his works, and again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore, verse 6, it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom first preached did not enter it because of disobedience. Again, he designates a certain day in David, saying, today, after such a long time, today, if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And so he goes through talking about Joshua there. And here's the mixed metaphor, the Sabbath. We oftentimes will make a comment, 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the new covenant, right? No other gods before me. Is that repeated? Absolutely. No graven images. Is that repeated? Right. Covetousness, idolatry. You shall not speak in the name of the Lord in vain, right? That's in the New Testament. Adultery, murder, covetousness, all of that's repeated over and over. The only one of the 10 commandments not repeated is what? The Sabbath day. You should keep the Sabbath day holy. Number 4, okay? That's the only one not repeated. But if you look in Hebrews chapter 4, it is repeated. But it's not a specific day, it's a person. Now, notice where the writer of Hebrews is going here, and it's hard in our mind to get this. Our rest is not found in a day of the week. Our rest is found in a person. Okay? Our rest is not found on a day in a calendar, but it's found in a person. Okay? We see John 10:10. What's the end of that verse say? I've come that they may have life, and they may have it more abundantly. Jesus, as he's speaking to his apostles, says, peace I give to you, not as the world, but I give you true peace, right? Isaiah, in his prophecy of Jesus, calls him the Prince of Peace. And so, as Christians, you and I, we find peace. Now, the Jews saw that on the Sabbath. That was the day in which they could rest from their labors, the day in which they could be with their family and enjoy those who are around them. You and I, we find it in a person, Jesus, and it's a better rest, a more fulfilling rest. Because no matter how much you love the weekends, guess what comes Monday, right? If you live for the weekends, it's a bummer because there's always Monday, okay? The thing about our peace is there's no end to it. He's always there. And so we're mixing the metaphors of Joshua and also of the Sabbath there as well. And so as you look through, you see that. Now, that also speaks of going to that promised land and being there forever. Chapter 5, a greater mediator. And if you've been around much on our Wednesday night class in here, you have heard chapter 5, even though it comes from a different perspective, as we've been going through the book of Leviticus. In the Old Testament, they had a guy named a high priest. And he would offer a sacrifice. And he would have to sacrifice for himself. Then he would sacrifice for the people. And then he would go into the tabernacle. He would go into the holy place, and the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was. It could only be done one day a year. And he would there offer up that blood upon the top of the Ark of the Covenant called the mercy seat for the sins of all the people. Now that was all a precursor of what Jesus does for us today. And so as you and I read through chapter 5, let's begin in verse 1. For every high priest taken among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both the gifts and sacrifices for sins. And he can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, because he also is subject to weakness. Because of this, he's required for the priest also for himself to offer sacrifices for sin. For no man takes his honor to himself, but it comes through Aaron. Okay? Now, we see where Christ did not have to have a sacrifice for himself because he's perfect, right? And so skip down, for the sake of time, let's skip down. Verse 9, him having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say, and it's hard to explain, but you become dull of hearing. So there he talks about how they need to learn and grow. We'll talk about Melchizedek here in a second. What he's saying here is we have a high priest who's perfect. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize, but who is all points tempted as we are, yet he was without sin. 4:15. And he offers that sacrifice. Now, in a sense, it's good to have that priest who always fails and falls short because it makes us feel comfortable. He's not perfect, we're not perfect either. But in a holy sense, with Jesus, it's comforting knowing that we can follow somebody perfect, somebody who can be with us through anything that we face. All right, now let's go to chapter 6. As we look at chapter 6, we see the promises of how we can fall away. Okay? And so you see several different examples of those who fell and did not make it. The greatest illustration is Israel, right? 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 5, we see that these people came, following God. They, because of disobedience, because of sexual immorality, and because of a lack of faith, all died in the desert. 1 Corinthians 10 says, beware of them, because that's what happens to many Christians today. Hebrews chapter 6 says the same thing. He says, listen, those people in the Old Testament, because they weren't faithful, they lived under a nation status. If they were faithful, their nation was better. If they were unfaithful, their nation went into obscurity. If they were unfaithful, they died, right? And that's a bummer. You don't want to die, right? If they were unfaithful, they died. In the new covenant, greater blessing, but also greater responsibility. If you're unfaithful to God, does fire shoot out of the altar and burn you up? Probably not. Unless you got a weird special effects guy at church. Okay? What happens? You don't die in the wilderness, but you die for eternity. And so the writer of Hebrews, see, He's gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, talking about, man, what you got is so much better, what you got so much better, what you got so much better. Now suddenly in 6, he says, but wait a second. Because you have something better, suddenly there's a lot more responsibility which is there. When I was a junior in high school, we had an economics class. And what we did in that economics class, the later part of the class, is he would give each one of us, he would say, listen, here is $5,000. And back then, you had to use newspaper. See how old I am? Have y'all ever heard of a newspaper? Okay. Back then, we had to go through the newspaper. And what he was doing was he was having us look at stocks and try to determine, okay, what stocks would you buy? What would you short sell? And he was trying to show us how the stock market worked. And so we all used our money, and, we would try to diversify and everything else that went across, all these different things like that. And so we would invest in different things. This is back when stocks were in the 812 mode, instead of the decimal mode, which we have. And you'd go across and you would invest in different things. Let me tell you, I became a millionaire in about 2 months. And then I was really broke the next month, okay? There for a while, it was really good. And so I liked it because I got to walk in class and go, I'm a millionaire. Look how smart I am, and see if people would copy me or whatever. And then other days I'd come into class and I just lost my shirt, and it was a bummer, okay? Now, that's fun to do in school, but you get in real life, you start investing, it's even better if you start winning, right? Man, things are awesome. But what happens if you start losing? That's real money you just lost. Definite bummer there. Same thing with the old covenant. It's greater blessings, but it's also a greater responsibility that's there as well. The reason I gained so much money in doing stocks was not because I knew what I was doing. It was the first Gulf War, was when I was a junior in high school, and I invested everything in Caterpillar. And because I knew that they were going to use a lot of bulldozers to fix all those oil wells that were busted up. But after about a month, everybody else in the world knew that too, and I lost all my money. All right, let's keep going here. Chapter 7, it's greater priesthood. Christ is our high priest who has not sinned ever. Chapter 8 is a greater covenant that we're under and a greater covenant that we can experience. And so in chapter 9, I usually in my outlines call this a greater sacrifice. I changed it in this for different reasons, talking about the tabernacle, partially because what I'm talking about on Wednesday night. But there's a sacrifice which is here, which Christ comes. Now, it was neat in the Old Testament because you could actually see the result of your sin. Because the family would have to be there watching, or at least the male of the family would have to be there, and they would watch that cow or that goat, which they had loved, the firstborn, worth a good percentage of their entire value on this earth, their entire financial portfolio is there, and they would watch that throat be slit and that blood pour out. And that would move you, right? You would see, he's dying because of my sin. Well, what we see here is Christ sacrificed himself. In the Old Testament, you would sacrifice, and that sin would be taken care of, but guess what you got to do next year? You got to do the whole thing all over again. You got to come up with another bull that's firstborn. You've got to come up with another goat or a pigeon or whatever it is, and you've got to go through the same process. How many times did Jesus have to be sacrificed? Once. It was a perfect sacrifice for all the people of time past and for all the people of time future. It covered everything. And so as you get into chapter 9, you see, man, this is the perfect sacrifice. And so let's start looking through this climax really quick. Verse 23 of chapter 9. Therefore, it is necessary that copies of these things in heaven should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered into the holy place with hands, which are copies of the true, but in heaven itself to appear in the presence of God. Not that he should offer himself often as high priest who entered the holy place of the blood of another. He then would have to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now once at the end of the ages he has put away sin, the sacrifice of himself. It is appointed man what to die once, but after that the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many, to those who eagerly await for him apart from salvation. Okay? You see that which is there? All right. Thanks for being here. Come tonight at 6 o'clock, and we'll have another lesson.